Have you ever been lost? I suppose that we've all been lost in various ways. Haven't we taken a wrong turn on a country road and found ourselves somewhere completely unrecognizable? Or jumped on the wrong bus, not noticing the number and ending up in a foreign part of town? And you may know by now about my sense of direction. And the problem is that I don't have one to speak of. If a normal sense of direction was a thoroughbred horse, mine would be a blind inchworm. I've managed to get lost in relatively small buildings. I can very easily get lost following simple directions. Past the first turn left over there, I'm gone. When faced between a simple choice between left and right, I almost invariably choose the wrong one. And because it's so easy for me to get lost, I live with a pretty high level of anxiety whenever I have to get somewhere on my own for the first time. When I first came to London, there were very few buses that announced the stops. And since I didn't really recognize much of anything, a bus trip to just about anywhere was a big challenge. I'd have to leave extra early. I'd study the maps before I went, staring at them the whole trip, trying to trace our progress on the paper, starting to panic when I couldn't match the streets to the map for a moment. And even with all that, I'd often miss the stop. I'd get out at some unfamiliar place, not sure if I'd gone too far or not quite far enough, and try to find the bus to come back. And then there are those lovely walks in the country, rambles, hikes, whatever you want to call them, these activities that sound so pleasant to most people, strike terror in my heart. In places without street signs and people to ask the way, without better instructions than bear right at the unusual tree, or turn left at the big old rock, you really have to rely on some inner sense of orientation, which I lack completely. Now, some of you will not be able to relate to this fear at all. You have a confidence that you can always find your way back, and I envy you deeply. For me, it's very different. But what's so terrible about being lost? At the most basic level, I suppose I'm afraid something is going to happen to me out there where it's dangerous. I'll freeze to death, or I'll be eaten by a wild English... I could still freeze. I could get very cold. Okay, it's a remote possibility. But what about starvation? Thirst? Okay, so there are some practical issues to being physically lost, but it's fair to say that they loom rather larger in my imagination than they do in real life. But the words of one of the best-known hymns in the English language, the one we sang just a few minutes ago, speak of a rather different kind of being lost. I once was lost, but now I'm found. Amazing Grace was written by an English clergyman called John Newton. And Newton had a pretty interesting life, to say the least. By all accounts, he was pretty damn awful in his youth. A master of profanity. He was known for making up new profanities. I mean, he was really good. He was a deserter, a mutineer, and a professional slave trader. And then later in his life, Newton had a dramatic, although not sudden, turnaround. He gave up slave trading, but for at least a while, he retained the other awfulnesses of his character. But eventually, he became a clergyman, and apparently a reasonably good one. So Newton went from being a slave trader to being an abolitionist. And although he never said as much, many assume that this is what Newton is referring to when he talks about being lost and being found. From being on the side of a terrible evil to the side of compassion and justice. And Newton took inspiration for his hymn from an obvious source, from the Bible. In the book of Luke, the story is told of the prodigal son who returns after having taken and then squandered his inheritance. But he is warmly welcomed back by his father, who says of him, "He was lost and has been found." The message of that parable is that God, represented by the Father, is ready to love and welcome us, all of us, even if we have ventured very far from the good. Even if we are lost, we can still be found. Have you ever been lost? We're coming up against theology here, and that means we may each go in very different directions as we think about being lost and being found. Being lost to whom? Being found by whom? What does that mean? But I think that it really doesn't matter exactly how we understand the nature of things, whether or not we believe in a supernatural God that can find and embrace us. What I know is that we can feel lost. We can feel very lost. We can feel at times that we don't know who we are, that there's no point in going on, that there's no way to get back to a place that feels true, a place that feels like home. Although as Unitarians we declare our belief in the inherent worth and dignity of every person, there are certainly times when we lose or we are lost to that sacred self within. When we feel lost, no place feels like home. No place feels safe. We are on guard, frightened, perhaps aggressive, often ready to numb the pain with one addiction or another, a remedy that only worsens our situation. And when we are lost, we need to be found. I think of those great old films where the heroes come riding, charging in on their galloping horses to save the day. But this kind of being found we need is very different from the divine rescue team that appears out of nowhere, angel wings beating and gentle hands reaching down to hold us. As much as I would like that to be the case, being found is not something I can ask anyone to do for me. It's up to me, at least, to participate in my own finding. There was a devout believer who heard an urgent news report on the radio that a flash flood was within minutes of the valley in which he lived, and he immediately fell to his knees and began to pray. And he prayed for safety, and those words were still on his lips when the water began gushing under his door. And then he retreated to the first floor of his house, and then to the second floor as the waters rose, and finally to the roof of his house. And on the roof, a helicopter flew by, and the pilot called down over the loudspeaker if they can lift him off. And he said, "It's not necessary. I have the Lord's protection," he replied. And moments later, the house began to break up, and he found himself clinging to a tree, and along came a police boat, braving the waters, approaching him for rescue. But he assured them, "The Lord will save him." And finally, the tree gave way, and the man went to his death. He found himself standing before the Lord, and he asked, "Lord, I'm glad to be here, but why didn't you answer my prayer for safety?" And God responded, "Son, I told you over the radio to get out of there. Then I sent you a helicopter and a motorboat. What more did you want me to do? Well, whether we believe in that kind of God or not, our being lost and found is very much in our own hands. We must participate with the universe. Can we ever truly be lost? My faith tells me that we have a place. We have a worth that cannot be diminished. We are home. And although we can never truly be lost, we can forget where we are. We can lose the knowledge of our interconnection, of our worth, lose our awareness that in fact we are home. Albert Einstein is credited with the words that form the first line of David Wagner's poem, Stand Still, as we heard earlier. Stand still. The trees ahead and bush beside you are not lost. You are not lost. No matter how far you have wandered, you have only to rediscover that you are home. It's easy to lose sight of where you truly are. We are subject to all varieties of illusion and delusion, drugs, shame, guilt, alcohol, desire, greed, fear. All of these can make us certain that we are far from our true home. And we all get lost. And we all need to be found sometimes. And this is a place for being found. It's a place where we can remind each other of what home is. Every time we call each other to be our best selves, every time we treat one another as if we are sacred, every time we expect the best, every time we push ourselves a little bit more to act with trust, with kindness, with compassion, with understanding, every time we do these things, the illusions fade just a bit, and the glimmering vision of home becomes clearer. We are the lost, and we are also the rescuers. We are the creators of the place called home. May it be so.